Good morning for everyone. My name is Juarez Lopes Ferreira da Silva. Have the pleasure here to be the chair of this Cine webinar today. And I am member of the Cine, the Center for Innovation on New Energies, the coordinator of the Education and Dissemination of Knowledge. Today, we're going to have the pleasure to have here with us in this Cine webinar, Professor Dr. Denise Driscoll. He just get on the stage with us. She is her background is a psychologist. Okay, is quite different from what we have talked different the last in webinars. But you're going to understand the reasons why we invite her. She is a professor at the Purdue University in the United States, and as a part of she's a director, one of the directors of the C-Star for the Diversity and Inclusion, and where they take very serious the part about the gender, how to promote values, and how to promote the reward of their members, and how to discuss that. Today, she's going to talk about to be here with us to talk about the how to discuss about bias, okay, in the general concept, okay, and then Denise, we are very happy to have you here with us, okay. I just provide the stage for you, okay, and then thank for this opportunity to be here with us.
Thank you so much. So welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And today, I'm going to talk about bias. And an important aspect of bias is not just knowing about it and understanding what bias is, but the importance of being skilled at detecting bias and also responding appropriately, responding in a way that's constructive. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'll set the stage first by giving you an overview of the book, of the talk. So the talk, we're going to first talk about why should we care about bias, and I'll give you some examples. Second, we're going to talk about practice detecting and responding to bias. And this is where you'll be watching a video and looking to see if you can detect gender bias in this case and thinking about what your response would be. So it'd be best if you do have a piece of paper, some note paper that you can make some notes on just for yourself, a pencil or a pen. And then we're going to end with the bigger picture, because oftentimes people talk about bias, how prevalent it is, but then they say nothing about how to fix the matter, how to problem solve. So I'm going to be talking through some of what we know about how to counter bias and how to de-bias a team. So let's begin with the story, because we're all coming from different places in how much we've thought about and we know about cultural differences, interacting across different cultures, what bias would be within a particular culture. And so I'm going to start with a story. A friend of mine had his very young children, and they were traveling around England, and they decided that they would take the Channel Tunnel to go to France. And so they told their young children in the car they were driving that, they were getting them excited. They're saying, pretty soon we're going to be in France. And they kept talking about, being in France. And so they started out and they were driving and they finally went into the tunnel. And the tunnel is extremely long. And as they went on, there was dead quiet. And all of a sudden, one of their young kids in the back of the car piped up and said, "Boy, France sure is dark." And what he was saying is that was his concept of France. We all start with knowing very little and then learning about cultures. The more you travel, the more you interact, the more you experience, the better understanding you have of the different kinds of rules in place, the different contextual norms. And so that's critical when you're dealing with understanding and responding to bias. So we're going to kind of keep that in mind, that we're all at different places in thinking about this. But why should we all care? Why should you care about bias? You're thinking you're an engineer or scientist, you're dealing with the scientific method. This is not particularly an issue that comes up for you potentially. But I'm going to try and set the context for how bias not only affects how we interact with each other, but it can also have an influence on your research. You can have bias creep in, unbeknownst to you, inadvertently, with no intention. It can have an impact on decisions you make for your research. But we're going to talk about bias in general and then implicit bias. So why should you care? Oftentimes, we're in very diverse teams, particularly in fields such as engineering and the sciences. People come and collaborate from all over the world. You probably are doing graduate work with people from several different countries, different kinds of backgrounds, different cultures. Even within a country, there's very different cultural norms and expectations, particularly in STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. And so one thing you have to think about if you're on a diverse team, and especially if you're leading a diverse team, is you have to do a cost-benefit type of analysis. Because when there's bias on the team, it's going to make the costs higher and the benefits lower and get in the way of the team working effectively. So for example, some of the costs are that the group conflict is potentially higher when you bring people from many different backgrounds. You might have worse communication. People might not be all speaking the same first native language, so they might have different communication styles and skills. There might be other culture-related challenges, and that can lower team cohesion. So you're not working as effectively. On the other hand, we've seen the science has shown great benefits of diverse teams, that there's more innovation, more divergent thinking, coming at a problem from different directions, that there's better talent utilization if you're taking people from the best and the brightest from all backgrounds, and you make better decisions. And so if there's bias, oftentimes, especially if it's extreme, you get none of the benefits of diversity and all of its costs. Another reason to care is that they've shown that a culture of inclusion, that if you're an inclusive leader, that you want to create a culture of inclusion because once again, that maximizes talent and the benefits. Teams come up with more innovative, cutting edge research. So once again, if you're thinking about what's an inclusive culture, a work or study place, you can think about it being a place where there's fairness. People perceive they're treated with respect. It's open to different ideas and collaborative. And then if you look at the inner circle, you also have a workplace where people feel like they identify with where they work or study, that they feel committed to what everybody's working on. If you're working on a team, for example, that there's cultural intelligence and understanding that not everybody's going to do things or say things or be as direct or indirect on the team. And that you're wanting to get people to feel interconnected so they work well together and also have some fun. If there's bias, you have less inclusion and often people leave. So you have what's called a revolving door. As soon as you hire people from diverse backgrounds, then they'll leave because they're not happy with how they're treated. To start thinking about types of bias, I wanted to show a short video that's an awareness test. So if you just sit back, we'll show it's about a little over a minute long.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So this is interesting, and hopefully it worked for you if you've never seen it before, but if so, you can think back to when you first saw it. Most people do not see the bear, but then once you see it, you're like, how could I have not seen it? And so it's a very interesting test of your focus, where your attention is. It's much like different kinds of psychological illusions, where you see here, I listed a couple where it depends on the pinpoint, the focus of your attention. If you see a young woman, so you can see the chin and the feather coming out, or you see an old woman where it dropped down and her chin is this, and it's her nose now, or the Necker cube, if you've ever played with how you can change the focus of what part of it is forward and what part of it is back. So this is the power of directed awareness. And I start here because it's important that you're paying attention. Otherwise, oftentimes you don't see bias. So, and particularly if we're convinced that we are rational, logical, scientific, we're not ruled by our emotions, we are the ones seeing reality for what it is, then you're going to fall prey to all kinds of biases, especially what I call the blind side bias. That's the bias that's commonly known that people are like, well, there's bias out there, but it's not me. So I'm not biased, it's everyone else. So the first step is it's important to direct your attention that there's even bias out there. You can look, there's a huge literature establishing this, that bias is present, but you often don't see it. But we know we can do things to make people see it, direct their attention. Like you can tell people to take the perspective of somebody in a group, and then they'll see that somebody's saying something that's biased and they wouldn't have seen it otherwise. Or you can give empathy instructions, get them to care about somebody on a team, and then they're going to be more aware of bias. So there's all kinds of ways to direct people's attention. To back up before talking about implicit bias, what is bias generally? Bias is a systematic error in thinking that occurs when people are processing and interpreting information in the world around them, and it affects their decisions and judgments that they make. You might have heard of a very famous psychologist, Kahneman, and his collaborator, Tversky. They did a lot over the years to establish all kinds of ways that we're biased in how we make decisions and how we process information. There's a great book I'd recommend, Thinking Fast and Slow, if you're interested. Just to kind of give you a couple examples of types of biases before talking about one that's more interpersonal, the implicit bias, is the confirmatory bias. This is a bias where you see illusory correlations. They're not really there. You perceive an association that's not there objectively. Like even if you present information where the lawyer is not being more aggressive than anyone else, because people have a stereotype of lawyers being aggressive, they're going to perceive that they did more aggressive things. So that's one type of bias. Another kind is hindsight bias. You say, I knew that was going to happen, when really it couldn't be predicted ahead of time. Or the gambler's fallacy. This is situations of logic where the coin, you flip a coin, it landed 3 times in a row face up. And so people just are convinced that there's a higher probability next time it's going to be tails, when the odds really are still 50-50. And then final example would be an attributional bias. Where our attention is directed is very different. If I trip over a cord in a room, then I'm going to say it was a situation, but you're going to think I'm clumsy. I notice a situation, you notice me, the person, as the cause. So we make very different explanations for behaviors. All these biases are pretty important, but I want to focus in on one. And to kind of set the stage, I want to tell another story. If I was in person with you, I'd tell you that if you know the answer, please don't say anything, but that doesn't matter here. Let me tell you the story here, and you can read along. A father and his son were involved in a car accident in which the father was killed and the son was seriously injured. The father was pronounced dead at the scene of the accident and his body taken to a local morgue. The son was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into an emergency operating room. A surgeon was called, and upon arrival and seeing the patient, the attending surgeon exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's my son." And what you ask people is, can you explain this? And oftentimes some people sometimes get the answer immediately, but other people are very puzzled, and they start thinking about the situation and problem solving. And they'll say things like, oh, I know, it's a Catholic father. The father who died was a priest. And so the surgeon is the boy's father and the priest died. Or they'll say, oh, it's a diversity session. There's 2 dads, the father, the son has 2 dads. Or people will reach for things. And even in a biology session one time, they were like, well, it's cloning. I don't know, because they couldn't come up with the answer. But when you explain that the surgeon is the boy's mom, a lot of people are somewhat embarrassed that they didn't get it. It's not as though they, oh, women can't be surgeons. No, it's more that they were misled by the accessibility of the images and the way information is stored in our brain, that surgeons are more likely to be male, and that throws us off and leads to it being a puzzle instead of a very simple explanation. And so the important part of this is that sometimes we don't have access to what we're thinking. We can be thrown off by things that are accessible, and so we don't even know it's having an influence on how we're trying to problem solve. And that's an important point that sometimes is hard for people, because they think that they know what they're thinking. They don't understand that there's a lot more sometimes that is accessible, that's influencing them. So now let's take a specific focus on implicit bias and explain what that is. And then we'll have you actually do a detection and responding test. Not a test, it's a training. So implicit bias is a thought or feeling that an individual associates with a group, is unaware of having, and yet it can influence the behaviors that he or she consistently directs towards the group or group members in subtle ways, often only apparent to the person experiencing the bias, and sometimes not even then. So if you think of the continuum, here's implicit to explicit. When you're exhibiting implicit bias, you really had no intent to be biased. You have no awareness that you did it usually, and that's at the one extreme. And then you can kind of go all the way to the other extreme where somebody intends to stereotype. They intend to be biased against a person from a group. They have awareness of what they're doing. And that would be kind of like old-fashioned isms like racism and sexism and so forth. You'll often hear implicit bias talked to as automatic or unconscious bias as well. So let me give you an example, and it's an interesting one. It's not going to be in the video that I'm going to show you, but it's called the maternal wall bias. And this is where once a woman is pregnant or having a child or children, they're viewed as less competent or career-oriented. Of course, they immediately say, well, she should just, make sure everybody knows she's career-oriented. But the catch-22 is that if you're viewed as career-oriented, you must not be a good mother. So you get slammed in other ways. Now, the interesting thing about this bias, oh, and by the way, I should point out the picture I have to put, it's a thumb-sucking baby. Some people aren't used to looking at the ultrasound image, but it's actually a fetus sucking its thumb with, I think, the arm behind the head. But this is an interesting bias because men have a lot more exposure to it. 80% of men have observed or heard instances of maternal wall bias when examples were described to them. Only 35% of females responded yes to having observed or heard instances of maternal bias. So now that we've talked a little bit about bias and what it is, let's talk about practice. How do you practice and how do you detect and respond to bias? And I think it's better doing than anything else. So I'm going to take you through a video, but first I once again have to set the stage. I want to prepare you because we created a practice tool that works pretty well for getting people to understand detecting and responding to bias. I want to note that these are actors in the video, so don't hate on them. Oftentimes when we're running participants and they're watching it, they end up really, really hating. And one of the people in the videos, one of the guys, but they're actors, and they're using scripts based on a 2017 series of interviews with MBA students and undergraduate students from several countries, very international, our business school. We took the most prevalent instances that they reported seeing, hearing, or experiencing, and this was both men and women, when women were the targets of bias in a team. Bias occurs more in skewed groups, so we made sure the team was 1 woman and 3 men. This mimics a lot of STEM teams, especially in certain fields of engineering and science. And
we should probably start by introducing ourselves.
Before we start the video, thank you. Could we go back to the other slide? I have to set the scene a little bit more. So we did study reactions to this video before using it as a training tool. Just so you know, we had 30 participants and they were thinking about the team process and how cohesive the team was, how effective and how inclusive was the team and how much did they like one another. There was no mention of bias to these 30 participants beforehand. And then what you see in their think alouds is a real mix that some saw some bias and a lot of others did not. So it's just a noted effect once more that if we point out that there's going to be bias, you're going to see it. It's more obvious, once again, if your attention is directed to the presence of bias. So if I tell you to see the dancing bear, you're going to see it. If you don't mention it beforehand, a lot of you didn't see it. Same thing here. Once I tell you to detect bias, everybody's like, well, a lot of that was obvious. Not the case here, that we've studied it and seen that it's a real mix in terms of who even sees bias or not. And finally, this is not meant to mimic reality. It's a detection and response task. You're going to see crunched all together many built-in instances of implicit gender bias. And actually, it's not only implicit, some are very explicit. So it's along that continuum. We purposely packed in a lot of instances into a few minutes because we want you to see bias. We're not trying to be realistic. We want you to see how it can happen on teams and think about, once you see it, how would you respond? So now we're ready to see the video, but we're going to pause it 3 times. Each time, jot down some reminder notes on what bias you saw, just what happened as a reminder to yourself, and how you might respond if you were a member of that team. Afterwards, we're going to go through the video and discuss the biases. So let's go ahead now and start the first segment.
So we should probably start by introducing ourselves. My name is Jacob.
I'm Jeff.
Adam.
I'm Emily. So it looks like we have a consulting problem here. We're helping Ozone X launch a new line of poultry products. They're making their chicken taste indistinguishable from red meat. That's really weird.
Can I see that?
Interesting.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So we're a consulting company helping this Ozone X market poultry that tastes indistinguishable from red meat, and they're doing this because red meat's actually the #1 cause for climate change. All right. So I think we should look at their the market they want to penetrate, and then create a penetration strategy that aligns with their marketing strategy. So I think it'd be helpful if we just had someone on the side taking notes. My handwriting's awful, so probably shouldn't
Mine
do
too.
it.
Same.
I guess mine's okay. I can take notes.
Oh, great.
But I mean, it doesn't seem like we need that many.
Yeah, you could just take a few notes and then write our decisions down at the end.
Yeah, let's just keep in mind that we need to present our ideas and in a way that we can compare them to the marketing strategy
Okay.
they gave us.
Sounds good.
Okay, so go ahead and jot down a few biases you saw and how you might respond. We'll give you about a minute. So okay, so let's go ahead to the second segment.
Can I say that real quick?
Oh yeah, of course.
Thank you. Yeah, so like you said, we just have to find a penetration strategy. So the marketing data says that, it's per capita consumption by region, population segment, and by season. So Jeff, do you want to do by season?
Yeah.
Adam, you can do by population segment.
Sure.
And then I can do by region. Yeah.
Are there any data points that stand out to you guys? I can't really read it down.
Here, guys, take a look at this. It looks like Canada has the highest per capita for poultry, which means they have the highest demand. So they might actually be the best place to look at right now.
Yeah, Ozone X marketing strategy says that they want to launch their product in the United States because that's where the largest population of beef is, and they want to take out their largest competitor first. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I see where they're going with that, but I mean, have you ever heard of the concept in marketing that's innovation adoption?
Yeah.
So basically, when Ozone X wants to introduce something innovative into the market,
Right.
they first need innovators and people who are going to adopt it first. So that creates this and this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I learned about that in marketing. I was just letting you know about their marketing strategy.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry, yeah. But, you know, don't hold back with the good ideas. You know, we need those, so.
Okay, once again, go ahead and take a minute to jot down any biases you saw and how you might respond. Okay, let's go ahead and do the final part.
I can figure out which one has the highest demand and choose that one.
Yeah. So demand for poultry is highest in Canada during the winter for ages 18 to 25. And that makes sense to me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever been to Canada?
Yeah, my family used to vacation there.
Oh, how was it?
It was great. We always went in the fall, so like the leaves were changing colors and it was always really beautiful.
It's awesome. Sounds beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear they get like a lot of snowfall during the winter.
Oh, yeah.
Like so much so that you kind of have to like dig out your front door, which
Wow.
sounds like a nightmare, but.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, what happens if the snowplows just like don't come? Are you just like walking?
mean,
You're stuck
on
at
top of
home.
that?
I assume a
guess
lot of
so.
people have like their own plow that they can attach on the front of their cars. Since
I guess so,
since
yeah.
it's more, since people would need it more than
Yeah, it'd
say
be like
here.
a good
Here's the
investment
thing.
for there.
How do you
Yeah.
get in your cars? Like, I lived in a cold place, not as cold as Canada, but like the ice would just like shut the door. Like, you'd have to pull on the door handle to
Maybe
open
just
it.
like a
It's
hairdryer,
crazy.
something like that.
We should probably get back on task, guys.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we have our market that we want to penetrate. So we should probably meet up again to create a pitch idea. All right.
Yeah, that sounds good. We can create a group meet, and we can coordinate our schedules through there.
Cool. Yeah.
We should also probably create a Google Drive so that we can post our decision.
I'm just warning you guys now that I have a ton of group me's, and I might put this one on mute, so I'd have to kind of inform me what I missed during class if there was anything that was said.
I don't blame you.
Oh yeah. I mean, with GroupMe, it's just like you keep forgetting to like turn them off.
Also, I think we should probably create a Google Drive. We can put our emails in the GroupMe, and someone can add us all to one.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So since you are already going to post our decision, do you mind starting it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
All right, nice. Well, if everyone's feeling good, I say that we're done.
Okay, and finally, just take a minute to write down any biases and how you might respond, and then we're going to go through the video and discuss. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to go forward and talk through the different biases that were built into the video. So the first was when the female was interrupted and the man asked to see the paper and then took over by repeating what she had just said. This is a type of bias where oftentimes who's interrupted depends on status, power, and that kind of thing. And so this is one instance. And once again, not everybody sees this. About half of the people. And how people respond are very different. Some people said, well, I would take the paper back. Other people would do nothing. And so I think that's the interesting point about bias, is that we all respond in very different ways, and depending upon our purpose and how we feel about the group. And we'll talk about what kinds of things come up in a little bit, but let's get through the other biases that were built in. When the female is the default person and agrees to take notes, this is probably one of the most obvious that a lot of people see. So it's more explicit bias. And a lot of people respond, once again, very differently to this. Some women say, I don't mind, I remember more when I take notes. Other women are not so happy with having been kind of put in that situation. So there's a whole range of behavior and responses here, and also differences in how you could intervene. I know in many engineering schools, for example, they rotate who takes notes in a team so that it doesn't end up being always one person and being a problem. When the female was assigned only a note taker role and not given a more substantive assignment. So you might have missed this. A lot of people do, but all the others were assigned different things to do, and she was simply left being the note taker. And this, once again, is something that people respond to very differently. Some people are very upset with that happening. Other people don't even see it. And so there's a range of responses here. Another bias built in is when the female goes unheard by the group. When she mentions in a joking manner, she can't read the paper upside down. This, once again, is a technique that often people use when there's bias. They might make a joke. To what extent the team noticed here, they really didn't. They just kind of kept going. But she was trying to make a point, and it wasn't effective. And so this is another kind of bias that we built in, is when people try and say, look, I'm part of this team too. When the male is explaining a marketing concept, even though the female is saying she already knows it, this has been labeled a lot. So you've probably heard mansplaining. And this, once again, happens when she's trying to say, yes, I know, and it's continued to be explained to her. Here's a bias when the female mentions the group should get back on task and is met with a somewhat negative reaction. This one, too, is called tightrope bias, that there's a penalty when women act in a more assertive or what's called masculine manner. And some of the responses I thought I'd share, and this first one's from a male subject. If it would have been a man, they'd have been fine with him getting back on task. Some people thought they were fine. Others said, well, they were a little embarrassed or uncomfortable after she said, hey, let's get back to work. And then others thought it was outrageous how they acted. One of the guys eye rolled, and they were all mad at her. And so you can see that our perceptions, once again, are very different. Finally, ideas being overlooked by certain people to use a Google Drive. And later when it's mentioned, it's taken up. And then a last one is when the female is asked to do yet another administrative type of task, setting up the Google Drive. Some people think it makes sense in the context of what's happening. Other people say, look, this is the penalty, that oftentimes women are the ones doing more of the social organizing, the administrative roles. And so one thing to think about is just the effect of bias on a team, is how it really does get in the way of inclusion. They feel not respected, separate from the team. A lot of people reacted, and of course this was a constructed situation, but you can think about it playing out over a long time, that people feel uncomfortable, disheartened, that she's not being included. They took her idea, I'd be annoyed, irritated, frustrated, etc. And you can see that we did word clouds where afterwards the participants expressed how they'd feel, and you can see how negative they were for both men and women in the face of this type of gender bias. And one notion is that it really does help to maybe label your emotion, and it might help regulate how you're feeling and how you then can respond to bias. It also one important thing is being in this situation, people have very different explanations for what went on. Some people thought after watching the video that it was on her to fix the team. Well, she just needs to speak up more. Others found ways to call it anything but bias, coming up with different theories like, well, the guys worked together obviously before. She's a newcomer to the team. So there's all kinds of ways that different ways of seeing the same situation, much like our different experiences with culture. What we see is what we know. And so now let's talk about changing to the bigger picture. How do you counter bias, and how do you debias teams? It's somewhat easier to talk about what you shouldn't do. What you shouldn't do is avoid, ignore, explain away, or deny bias. It's like being computer avoidant. It doesn't get better to tuck your head down and pretend it's not there. It's also not constructive to direct negative attention to the person who might have corrected you and point out something you said or did. It's a natural reaction, but that doesn't help either. And it doesn't help to be negative towards yourself, like putting yourself in a timeout type of situation. Training has been shown to be helpful. So on a scale of 1, it didn't help, to 7, when we contacted people after seeing this and going through the training, they did better recognize the different ways that gender bias can occur on teams. They thought about how to respond when bias occur. They were thinking about bias even to other groups. It generalizes. And they also believe that if a team saw this ahead of time and just thought about it, it would help the team's unity, inclusivity, effectiveness, and liking for one another, that it would be helpful. It also gave more confidence about being able to respond effectively to bias. There was a little worry about accidentally being biased, which is not a bad thing, but they were more aware of how to treat people. We were worried people would get angry, but there wasn't very much anger. And people felt more comfortable then talking about implicit bias. Of course, people who went through this training were able to talk to one another about what they saw, what they felt, and what they would do, which I wish you were in such a situation too. But basically what studies are showing is that practice makes perfect. It helps with feeling regret that you should have done something and you didn't. It helps fight the paralysis that you did nothing, and afterwards you're thinking of all the ways you could have responded. But the best thing is to think about things ahead of time and how you might respond in a way that you're comfortable with, within parameters that maybe you practice. So I'm not going to go through a lot more detail because for the sake of time, but really it's about directing your attention first, that if you have low motivation, you're not really going to see the tiny little bias. But if you direct your attention and think about it, you'll see much more bias. The last video I want you to watch is one on countering bias, which takes a more problem-solving approach that I think you'll appreciate. So let's go ahead and watch this last one.
Orchestras have historically had far more male musicians than they had female, and so some of the women started saying, well, I think there's bias. And of course the people listening to the auditions were very skeptical of that, so they put up a screen, and so they wouldn't see the gender of whoever was auditioning. At first, the screen didn't change the percentage of women versus men being hired particularly much, but someone noticed that before some of the people auditioning, there was a click, click, click sound. High heels.
Once they asked people to remove their shoes, things in orchestras got relatively equal. So though it takes experimentation and refinement to work things out, people are finding solutions. The caution is that with the complexities of the real world, dealing with implicit bias isn't going to be a magic cure-all that fixes everything. Implicit bias explains some of the difficulties we face around race, but isn't the only factor. But it is something that all of us should actively think about.
So the two things to think about is that you have people in the room from diverse backgrounds. And so what happens once again when you don't is that you often make bad decisions. Here's a classic. I'm not going to go into it, but I encourage you to read a consumer report on airbags, where basically what's being used is a male type of airbag, much heavier and taller than a female and designed differently. And so you get a lot more still injuries of women driving. And once again, back when they were making these decisions, women weren't in the room. And things still continue, although I've heard there's a recent innovation with Volvo. So there's some hope there. What can help? The person under attack from bias is not the one who necessarily should have to respond, but it's very contextual, right? You want to be an ally and a mentor, but you have to do so appropriately when you detect and respond to bias. One of the best things to do to just wake yourself up, as we talked about, is take the other person's perspective, try and see things from their point of view, and have empathy. And also make sure throughout an organization, if diversity is represented at every level, from the top to the bottom, then people won't be silenced when things happen, when bias is introduced. The other thing to think about is how to counter bias skillfully. Maybe some things that went through your mind as you were watching the video is, well, how direct or indirect can people be? And that's very different for cultures where you'd maybe directly say, I'm not taking notes. And that would be very inappropriate in other cultures where you might find some other way to do it. Like, okay, I'll take notes. And next week, maybe you can during our meeting. And you'd set up a rotation. Another is how private or public these kinds of things are normatively, what's okay with it. You might have a culture that's very face-saving, and you shouldn't be calling out somebody in front of other people. Another thing people think of is the good focus on the team or the individual, the good of the team, or is it the individual who you have to look out for? And oftentimes people will ignore bias because they're kind of taking one for the team. It's not good to disrupt the team in that way. So it's good as a leader to be aware of these kinds of things, to consider power and the consequences of saying versus not saying. Sometimes people use humor or diversionary tactics. And also, you have to be aware of what's the attitude of the team. What is the culture saying? Are there traditional gender attitudes or not? All kinds of things come into play. And also, are you the one underrepresented in the room? And how will it be perceived and affect you if you speak up? Finally, I just want to end with a need to work on detection strategies, that when you have the cognitive ability high, you're not tired, you're not distracted, you've learned about biases for different groups and you understand. And when motivation is high, you're motivated to have an inclusive team, so you pay attention to whether bias is creeping in. That's going to be when you're doing a good job detecting. And also, we need to work on our responding skill. Once again, if you've thought about and you've practiced and your ability is high and you're sensitive to it, and also your motivation to maintain your inclusive teams, then once again, you're going to figure out and be attentive to all the different ways that you should respond. And I'll end with, well, you're never going to be woke, we call it. It's a process, and it's one where the more you work at it, the better you get. The idea of purity, you're never going to be compromised, you're always politically woke, all that stuff, get over it quickly. And the same thing with always being the one noticing and appropriately responding to biases. We're all going to be making mistakes. What I'd say is that if you are interested in thinking now about how coded bias might creep into your research, I'd encourage you to stream a wonderful documentary about an MIT researcher that found her face was unable to be detected by facial recognition software that she purchased. She was darker skinned, but when she held up a white mask, it worked. The film describes how machine learning algorithms lead to all kinds of biases that perpetuate social inequities and negatively impact lives. And this is really because of this belief that somehow these algorithms, they're less error ridden than humans. And yet, what's going to creep in is garbage in, garbage out. It's not unlike the brain. Algorithms, there's a black box there, what comes in and then what goes out. It's a mystery sometimes even to the people working on the algorithms. So in concluding, just thinking about being an inclusive leader, I'd say that in an increasingly global world, recognizing and responding skillfully to bias is a valuable skill set for anyone who wants to be an inclusive leader and benefit from diverse teams. I'd like to acknowledge my student collaborators and make sure I leave time for questions. So I'll turn it over to you now. I can't hear you. I think you're silent still.
Sorry, Liz. Thank you very much for the very impressive talk, and also concerned how to point out for us where are the bias, because from my own perspective here, it was not so easy to identify all the bias when you see it.
Yeah.
Even have it. Okay, we have some questions here. The first question that we want to ask to put, Marcelo, is from Albert. Albert to say, the question is written here, I think.
Interesting. I'd say that, bias is, oftentimes you'll know a group difference, for example. So there might be a difference in, men and women on certain identification tasks. What we tend to do is we might know that there's a difference, but we often exaggerate it. And that's a bias that we have. So I would say that intuition, probably the same type of thing happens, that maybe your intuition is built on your past experiences and what you've known or had happening to you. But once again, I'd say it probably isn't always a direct reflection of what's really going on. And that would be the bias creeping in. Does that answer a little bit the question? And you would also not want to tell people that intuition is wrong. It's kind of like when I was doing some training with police officers, oftentimes they're in dangerous situations. They don't have time to go, okay, let me stop and think about this and see if I'm being biased. They're oftentimes reacting very quickly. And so sometimes that's when bias is going to operate, when you don't have the cognitive capacity to slow down and stop. There's a lot of literature on if you just slow down and think about things, you'll be able to kind of perceive the real difference versus what's up here, what we've learned. More stereotypes.
Thanks. We have a second question from Agnaldo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are. Let me think if I can see it, because I know there's a wonderful, all the ways we're biased. I do know there's something called the own race bias, which I find fascinating because it's basically saying that you can identify people better from your own racial or ethnic background. And you can look it up, called own race bias. And so with eyewitness testimony, there's a real problem. Psychologists have been trying to make sure that people aren't convicted based only on eyewitness testimony, because of if the person who's being accused is a different race or ethnicity, oftentimes your identification is not great. You'll make mistakes and misidentify. So I think that's one example, but I know there's a whole litany of them. And also in terms of severity, if you look at Coded Bias, the film, there's a very interesting thing about how algorithms are letting people out, and there's racial bias in the algorithms. And it's because of what you program in. But anyway, thank you. There's a lot of those kinds of cases. So.
Okay, I think that there's for the few we want to have for the questions, but at the moment I have a question. Denise, for example, for example, put my case in the situation. For example, I am a group leader and also a principal investigator of Cine, and many times we face challenges. How to act when you see the bias, how to approach a member, and how to address the situation in a proper manner, because there are different aspects, how to approach a male, how to approach a female, and how to approach a student a student that's doing a master or PhD, or even a faculty member. I mean, how can you tell for us, for example, how a principal investigator, for example, in those type of situations, what's the best way? Because we can do a lot of training our mind how to act in different situations. But always there are some new things that comes together with the buyers.
Yeah, I'd say the more once again, attention's critical, right? Just paying attention is half the problem, because you're really in trouble when you're not seeing any of it, which often happens to us all, right? So the first step would be, if you care and you're motivated and you pay attention, people are always doing better than if not. So step one is attention. The second is listening to people, inviting and trying to understand their perspective. You know, a lot of people do different audits. I was going to talk about doing an audit of yourself and doing an audit of how you run things. For example, when I was, on faculty back in the 90s, I noticed that there was only 6 women out of 50, right? So mostly a male department. And yet the social committee was almost all women, if not all women. And I brought that up, and I said to the head of the department, I said, well, why are we always being put on the social committee? You know, I'm not particularly social. Why would I, and he said, oh, well, that's just coincidence. And I was like, well, when there's 5 out of 6 women on this, right? So I think it's also be open when people tell you there's an issue, because a lot of people want to explain it away. People are often now giving signals, and if invited would talk about it, but they have to feel safe. They have to feel like they're not going to be the problem child then, right? Because oftentimes when you bring up these kinds of things, you're going to get a reputation. And I don't want to suggest that there's also not people seeing problems everywhere that are a problem, right? It's not that every case is biased. Sometimes they didn't do a good job. And so that's what makes it all very complicated. And like I said, I wish there was a list. Here's what you do, here's what you don't do. But just like with anything, people are complicated. Interactions are complicated. And so we just do the best that we can. But attention and intention to do better is so much of the battle. Paying attention, being motivated.
Basically, I say, if I can summarize this the full is, we can put very good attention what is going around, and then hear what the people have to say for you, and act when it's necessary. Because sometimes you have just to listen it, because as you say, is a case, maybe it's not a bias from the perspective that you can see.
And I'd end with really saying to be gentle too. I really don't like it when people act as though the other person had mean intentions when really it might not be a matter. It's how we're socialized. We need to get, I mean, there are some people who are, racist, sexist, but most people try and be fair. They try and create a good work environment for others. So if you begin with that assumption, unless proven otherwise, then you have a much more cordial interaction, because I don't assume you're trying to do things that are having negative consequences for this group. I assume you want to do better. And I think that's 99% of the case. I found that when you talk and you don't accuse, when you don't attack, when you're gentle and realize, like the whole France thing, we're all at different places here, right? I have to be gentle with people who don't know things about computers when I do. I have to be gentle with people, we should be gentle.
Sure. We have a new question from Caroline Costa. Marcelo, just add it. Yes.
Yes, I'd say that's very much a confound, that sometimes it's difficult to tell whether you're being treated in a certain way because you're lower status or whether it's something to do with gender. And that's the puzzle all the time. There's lots of studies showing that everybody has this attributional ambiguity, it's called. We're not sure why things are happening. So when African Americans have some store person following them around, are they seeing if they're going to steal something, or are they just wanting to help them? And so there's always, as we go through the world, we're always having this kind of ambiguity of figuring it out. I mean, sometimes it's kind of obvious, right? Things let us know that it's bias or not. And so once again, this is the hard part. You have to understand what the person's intentions are. You have to seek out the context and the cues. You can easily notice, for example, in the department, I think I was 27 when I started as a faculty member, and everybody'd call me Denise, but they called this person Dr. Whatever, and Dr. They would never, or they'd call me ma'am. And so, those kinds of things were obvious because I'd look at my same aged cohort and see that they were treated differently. So sometimes you can puzzle it out. But then once again, you have to realize what's underneath it, and how to fix it is not always being negative back to somebody, but, educating people, telling undergraduates, well, I'm Dr. Driscoll, and telling graduate students it's okay to call me Denise, kind of thing. You set the rules gently.
Yes. Okay, I like the one point that you mentioned, Denise. That's it. Set up the rules, and then define it, what you expect. Provide expectations, what you want to work in the group. I think that is a very nice to say appointment that today.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we don't have additional questions, but I would like to have one question. I think maybe the last one. It's the opposite to the Caroline Costa question. For example, at our center, our director is Ana Flávia Nogueira. It means we are in the opposite side. That particular case, the female is the highest position. And sometimes, as you know, you also have to face the bias too. How do women face the opposite side when you say sometimes in the low in the ranking, but sometimes at higher ranking?
So I don't think I understood the question. You're saying the director is...
No, what I mean is the following, Denise. You have the two situations. One that was pointed out by Carolina Costa, when the females as at the lower ranking, but you have the opposite side too. The female is at a higher ranking. And the bias can have also the both sides too.
I think I would say that if you have an inclusive workplace, oftentimes there's enough of the respect, appreciating everybody's point of view, making people feel an important part of the organization. You have enough interconnectedness that everybody's working as a team. I'm sorry, but an administrative assistant who might be seen as low can have a lot of power when you really need something done. So I think it's respecting that everybody together. A cohesive team is the best team. And making sure that it's not only the people at the top setting the rules, but giving them the notion that it needs to be a little bit a collaborative effort to be successful, because otherwise talent leaves, right? They'll go somewhere else if they don't feel that inclusion, that sense of purpose and respect.
We have one additional question from Dr. Fábio Coral Fonseca, is your colleague that he was from the Cine. He visited the C-Star recently.
Yes, I remember. Nice to see you too. Thank you. I had to kind of rush through it, but thank you. Is there a way to evaluate how such examples of bias could impact their... Yes. Actually, we did have our faculty and students watch Coded Bias and then go into the rooms and think about how bias crept into the research. One very blatant example is that people value certain journals and certain research papers from some countries versus others. So that happens very much. And people get a reputation, and maybe they've been putting out great papers, but a very bad one will slip through. So that's some kinds of bias that I think everybody's seen and understands. But in terms of how it affects the research itself, I can give you a psychology example. I can't think of an engineering one right off the bat, but a psychology one would be that people initially were showing bias that the woman who's called Emily is treated different than John. The trouble was Emily was an old woman's name and people imagined her, and so lower ratings happened because of that. Then they had to redo the study with equally viewed names. I forget what the woman's name was, and they still found some bias, but not as much. So it shows you that they didn't mean to do this. We never mean to introduce bias into our research. That's the whole goal, is to be objective, follow the scientific method, but that sometimes it could happen. But I think the algorithm and the fact that the computer people programming it didn't set it up so that it wouldn't recognize the face of a darker skinned person. And it's actually not as good with women or men. They were just feeding it information that led to the bias. So I think that's kind of one way. So really having a discussion would be a way that a research team could kind of think about it, but presenting them with something like the coded bias, getting them to think about it, I think is a step one.
Okay. thanks for the comment and the news on the question, Fabio. And I have one question that we mentioned about these computer programs. You mentioned that, like machine learning. You feed information, feed, and the program, the machine learning model, take a decision. And then there's a bias there. The bias, of course, wasn't the data
Yes.
that was used. But this data is a product from our society.
Yes.
Meaning it comes the end. My question is the bias a product of the society that you try to correct it in this case or not?
Yes, in this case, a lot of that type of research, it is perpetuating the bias that's already in society.
Yeah.
And that's why you're having like the criminal justice system, differentially giving people parole. You're having people, in all sorts of places having different decision rules that even people didn't know. They actually implemented some teacher training and evaluation of teachers, and some of the best teachers got slammed by the algorithm. And the people didn't mean it. They didn't understand their own algorithm. Yeah. So it's very hard for people to understand that it's not just information that's factual coming in, that there is an element of bias in a lot of what we do. And that's why you need to be attentive and to be reflective and to consider carefully whether there's any type of bias affecting you. And that's different from field to field. It's always interesting to try and, understand how bias might affect like an engineer for someone like me. But they were able to do it. So I'd encourage maybe people to download and stream something like the Coded Bias to get those thoughts started.
Okay. We don't have additional questions from the participants. We have a comment from the Fab Coral Fonseca that I would like Marcel to just add his comment here, that what mentioned. And then I think there's a very good opportunity. I think this recently school that you organized it with the students from Cine, SGI, and also Star was a great opportunity to make these different discussions on the culture and background related to transition energy. So I think was a very great. We have to repeat it in the future because the students that took part on it, they really love it.
Yes, the feedback on the summer class on getting them to be global energy thinkers and better interculturally was wonderful. And I actually have a report I was going to send your way. But I'm also looking forward to visiting. I think we're just starting to think about that, and we'll be in touch. Love to do a Coded Bias training or talk to students one-on-one or faculty. It'd be great.
Okay. To close, I would like to thank you very much for your time to discuss with you about the bias, to provide the perspective, and also to open our minds how we should address different situations, because that different perspective too is very important. And then we should keep in contact to explore different opportunities to organize your visit to Brazil, of course, and to discuss everything in details. Thank you very much.
Thank you.